Good afternoon. I am super excited today to welcome you to today's Autry Salon. My name is Karimah Richardson. I am the curator of Archaeology and Osteology here at the Autry Museum of the American West. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of this land, the Gabrielino Tongva people. I am honored, along with the Board of Trustees, to welcome you today to today's Autry's Auto Salon. Today with me is Cindy Alvitre. I want to welcome her. She and Laureen Sisquak, co-founder of Mother Earth Clan, a collective of Indian women who created a model for cultural and environmental education with a particular focus on traditional art. In the 1990s and the 80s, she co-founded the Tiat Society, sharing the renewal of their ancient maritime practices of the coastal island Tongva. Cindy is currently the NAGPRA Coordinator and Faculty at Cal State Long Beach in American Indian Studies program. She is a cultural curator. Her work extends beyond the physical manifestation of expression that engages participants into native landscapes as a dimensional refocusing of our cultural lens. Thank you, Cindy, for joining me today. For me, you were the perfect second participant of our series because you have such a long history and understanding of the archaeology collection. And I would really like for you to share with our audience your history, how you got engaged with the Southwest Museum collection, with the Southwest Museum and the Autry.
Thanks, Karimah, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. And I'm really honored to be here to join in this very important conversation between Karimah and myself today. You know, I was reflecting on this the other day. I was on the phone with my BFF, Laureen Sisquak, curator at Sherman Indian Museum. And we were reflecting back on how long we've had this relationship with the Southwest Museum, which goes all the way back to the mid to late 80s. And at that time, it was Barbara Drake, one of our cultural educators, the late Barbara Drake. She passed away sadly in November, Laureen Sisquak and myself. And we were working with a few different folks. We were working with Barbara Arvey. She was in charge of education at the time, and Kim Walters, Bryn Potter, and even other individuals like Pam Hanna and many other people. But mostly we were inserted as the local people, as the Tongva people, and representatives of different Southern California Indian communities, mostly in the education sector. So we were there, we were helping to create educational curriculum, kind of guide that and train the docents. It was a beautiful time. There's a lot, you know, but I think also at that time, we also, oh geez, I'm sorry, but there's a trash truck outside.
That's okay.
I would have known today was trash day. I can't do that.
Yeah.
But at that time, I think one of the difficult parts was because we really didn't know what was behind the curtain, right?
Right.
We saw what was on the educational cart. We were able to see what was on an exhibit, but rarely there were not those moments when we were actually invited into the collections. I don't think it was until later on into the late 80s, into the 90s, when Bryn Potter really started to work on the basket collection. And we were actually invited into the basketry collection. And I remember that moment very well, because when I went into the basketry collection and saw 13,000 baskets, it was like walking into a room of 13,000 women who had been behind in the shelves for generations. It was really overwhelming. And I mean, we all knew that there was the sacred treasures, that the people were there underneath in the basements. We were surrounded, the building was just saturated with the presence of the ancestors, but they were invisible in many ways. And we have to remember that this was in a pre-NAGPRA era too. And that experience was not just confined to the Southwest, but I think it was across the board.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think it helps the audience understand why I wanted to kind of share the conversations that we've been having as we've been kind of diving into the collections. I always say the because I'm, the newest amongst a long line of predecessors who have, spent a lot of time investigating and learning about the collection. But we have been in a kind of 10-year moving, packing, repacking, rehousing stage. So now we're at this point again where we are going back into the collections to examine and relearn what we have. So thank you for joining me today. So just to keep us on track, because I know when we have our conversations, they kind of go into different directions. I thought it would be great to kind of orientate some of our audience who don't know who the Tongva Gabrielino people are. And then we can then have kind of a deep dive about the collections that we've been investigating, working on, discovering, and then kind of where we see the future of the Autry being a steward of specifically Tongva collections. So let's start. If you wouldn't mind, can you please kind of situate for our guests, the people?
Sure, Karimah. We see two different maps here, actually. We see on the left-hand side the map from Bernice Johnston's her book in 1962, which shows the village sites, but there wasn't much involvement with the community at that time, and it was based a lot on ethnographical material. And however, I don't know, I always saw this map kind of as the extension of the original journals, the Master Keys, the public.
Oh, yes.
And this became kind of an extended one. On the right-hand side, you see a map that was designed for a chapter I did in a book called Latitudes, an Angelino's Atlas, published by Heyday. But basically the Gabrielino Tongva, and it depends on how you call them. I mean, there's many names. We have selected Tongva as a name, the majority of the community, to call ourselves as people of the earth. They are the indigenous people. We are the indigenous people of Los Angeles County, Orange County, and the 4 Southern Channel Islands. But I'm not going to fall prey to the anthropological boundaries also, and have to acknowledge that, beyond that extends into the other areas, the geographies that we share and embrace with the Chumash and with the Tataviam, and even south to the Ahachimum and to the Quias and the Serranos. So, it's difficult, but I think that's basically who we are. And I was going to say the Southwest Museum, the Autry, there's a uniqueness there. There's a link,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
That's where the Autry is currently situated, is right there along that sacred LA River, right smack in the heart of many historical places and a lot of memory. The land is just saturated with memory that crosses over into the other tribes too. But yeah.
Thank you. And just because you mentioned it, we'll also just situate quite briefly the history between the two institutions. The Southwest Museum was the first museum of Los Angeles. It didn't have a building until 1914, but it existed as a society first, and then later a museum starting in 1907. And then in 2003, it merged with the Autry Museum of the American West. And as a result, the collections are now the second largest collections of Native objects in the nation. And what's not well known, and is why we're talking today, and we'll hopefully continue this series, is that a large portion of that collection is archaeological. And there's a reason why that is. It became kind of a focal point, as we kind of talked in our last series, for a lot of upcoming archaeologists associated to so many different Southern California institutions, and not only universities and colleges, but museums. And it became kind of a hub for systematic archaeological practice. So with that said, I'd love to get started and kind of do a deep discussion. So we're going to talk a little bit about the collections and the collectors, and then we'll shift to actually looking at some of the objects that we've been working on. So I'm often asked, so what collections do you have? Isn't it just Southwest? Because the assumption is you hear the Southwest Museum collection that the majority of our objects are from the peoples of the Southwest. In actuality, the archaeology collection is probably a 60-40 Southwest, 60-40 California. And not a lot of visitors know that. And the reason is I selected these 6 former archaeology curators and archaeologists who worked with the Southwest Museum. They did a lot of work in particular on the Los Angeles basin. So Charles Lummis, who's the founder, his practice was very informal, kind of collected off the ground as he saw it. So he himself was a collector of Tongva materials. Frank Palmer was a huge collector up and down the coast of California materials, but heavy in Redondo Beach, heavy on the Channel Islands. Edwin Walker, he was the lead archaeologist for a lot of projects within Tongva territory. We've talked about Malaga Cove. Malaga Cove has one of the older levels that he excavated about 6,000 years ago was the date that he set. Bruce Bryan, Charles Rosaire, George Kritzman, they did a lot of work on the Southern Channel Islands. And then Charles Rosaire also did a lot of survey and archaeology and excavation up and down the coast, especially in Los Angeles. So it was because of these 3 collectors, archaeologists, curators, that we have quite a large collection from Tongva territory. So, my question is for you, when you hear about these collectors and you talk about the access or the lack of access or what you didn't know about our collection, what does it mean now to you, to your community, to hear that because of these collectors, because of a couple of others, we have a large collection from your traditional territory?
Yeah, thanks, Karimah. I have a few things to say about this actually, because when I see these gentlemen's photographs projected on a screen, it's not just them, but I go back to their own histories and what their occupation became, and that was as collectors. And we do know that Los Angeles, in particular Pasadena, became the hub of collecting in this country in that process of nation building and museum building. It's very curious to me. It's very curious about, I have to think, why were people collecting? I can't proceed with this conversation without addressing that.
Right.
And there's this historical psychology to all of this. And I always think of it like this, that, by the late 19th century, Native American people were confined. In Los Angeles, the Tongva people had all but disappeared, and there was a lot of imagery that was circulating, these spectacular, exotic, sensational reporting that was going on of Indians kidnapping women and on, violence, these very disparaging images of Native Americans. And to me, it seems like people were collecting because it was the only way that they could participate in this sepia tone romanticism of having contact with the native. It was safe. It was comfortable, and it became the currency, not only the professional currency or even the capitalist kind of currency. It was also social prestige, such as the women collectors of basketry who worked with George Wharton James. That was the feminine art. Right. So the whole psychology to this, that I have to speak about too. Once
it's true.
Geopolitical space, how do you have contact with Native people? It's collective, but it's also becomes ushering in this era of invisibility too, right?
Right.
Because the people are all but gone.
Right. And I'm a proponent of being completely transparent, as I think that's the only way communities can heal, institutions can heal, is to kind of own their past. And one thing that we've learned as we've explored our collections is that people like Charles Lummis and, Frank Palmer, that's what they did. They went to the social society groups and they brought their objects and they brought them to show evidence of a community that doesn't exist, right? And so also started a trend or encouraged a trend. I mean, they didn't start it, but they definitely had a rhetoric, surrounding it that promoted it. And as a result, our institution, other museum institutions start to fill up with communities, material culture. And then, like you said, because there's the support, either they wrote the articles or they gave the talk that says, oh, the community doesn't exist. No one questions how much you collect and why.
Right. And they're feeding into the audiences, the larger national audience, which is government, professional, and personal.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, how does it, now that you have this knowledge and now you have this access, how do you think that should, connect to the greater Tongva community? Does the greater Tongva community understand and know all the institutions that have their materials?
Yeah, to me, it's righting a historical wrong. It's kind of flipping the equation a little bit, but also removing what happened with the process of collecting is that sacred objects, ancestral remains, objects of cultural patrimony, and they were removed from their Indian context and put into the context of a Western capitalistic currency, right? And as part of that too is the removal of those things that were personal to the people from their descendant communities, from their descendants and their descendant communities. So as part of that process there's a lot of things that needed to be reversed out. We've talked about this so much, Karimah. I mean, all the years that I've worked with you and with Dr. Teeter and other people, in some ways, collection history provides more information about a people than what we read in the American textbooks, in American historical textbooks. Because there's all the nuances, not just the collections themselves, but the individuals. When we go back to Palmer, when we go back to Walker, when we go back to Bruce Bryan, when we go back to Charles Lummis, and there's a whole lineage of collectors.
Right.
To understand what they did, when they did it, how they did it, and where they did it is important because it brings back the context of what we lost.
Right.
Palmer was noted for, I think by the time he was collecting, they said that they had excavated and uncovered most of the Chumash burial grounds in a 6-year period.
Wow.
And that's significant. And I mean, this conversation isn't about the trauma so much. I mean, it's being brought in. We need to acknowledge that.
Right.
Now, and it's only through the creation of collaborations and relationships with institutions who are in possession of these collections and have control of these collections, legal control, I'm using NAGPRA terms, right? That we can not only correct these imposed traumas onto the people and separations as invisibility to return that whole the visibility and the value and change the currency of these collections, but also we're making a contribution not only to the Tongva community, the Tataviam or the Chumash or Southern California Indian communities or other Native American communities, but to the future generations of our society, to the children, to people who do have a love for these collections also. I'm not going to dismiss that because without the people who have supported, this museum and the Southwest Museum.
Right. I mean, I think that's a great point. And I think what it makes me think of is I'm always asked, what's the, best thing we have in our archaeological collection, or, what sets us apart? And I always think about it a little bit. And I'm like, well, technically, there's nothing that we have that other institutions do not have. We've talked, a lot about how there's smaller historical societies, smaller museums who have, their Tongva or Chumash material, depending on where they are on the coast or interior in the desert. They have Cahuilla or, Serrano materials, or, we have materials in the Southwest, but of course the Southwest has those same materials, but in spades. But it's what you said. It's the institutional history, the where we were set in that timeline, the kind of systematic nature, the players who kind of gauged the field, encouraged the field, helped develop the field, is what kind of, I think, sets our collection apart from others. And kind of on that segue, it's you and I in our discovery. So I'm going to shift and
Absolutely.
share with our visitors kind of some of the objects that have kind of led to these discussions that we've been having about Palmer and Lummis and others, about what it means to kind of rediscover an archaeological collection.
And we know those rediscoveries, as you're shifting, have been something that we've experienced that when we've brought community members into the collections.
Right.
And see the reactions, such as most recently, Craig Torres, who's one of our cultural artists, and he had never seen the collection of abalone fishhooks.
Right. Which is
in the Canoes, which you're going to share with, or with Alan Salazar, who's Chumash and Tatavium, and his response and just the joy and of seeing the remnants of some of our canoe planks, or Heidi Lucero as a basket maker, and even Desiree Martinez, as an archaeologist. And we'll talk about that part of it, but we've experienced it.
Yeah, and it's been exciting. It's been exciting. Like I, shared earlier, we've been mostly in this packing, moving phase. So now that we get to unpack and come together and collaborate to discover what we have to put on display, we've been learning so much. For example, there's not too many, the Southwest is known, of course, for their 14,000 plus baskets, but what is not known as much is that we have perfectly preserved baskets that are from archaeological context. And this one here, that excited.
Wait, you need to move closer to your speaker.
Oh, sorry. So what excited us about this one, it was in great shape, and it's from one of the Southern Channel Islands. It was Juncus, and it's been looked at by both Justin Farmer in the 80s, and then again by Bryn Potter. And it's just a beautiful example of a basket from archaeological context. And I remember both you and Craig being excited seeing this basket that comes from a different context other than the ethnographic and the contemporary baskets that are all talked about within our collection. Can you share with the visitors what you thought about this particular object?
It's rare that we're able to even see a basket that has survived. Gabrielino tongue baskets are even more rare for many reasons. But to be able to see this, first of all, it's like seeing a relative that has survived, one that continues to be present, and that feeds the hearts of the people always. And to imagine who was the woman, or who was the man potentially too, who made this basket. But also, now that we're in the process, we have been since the 1980s, of renewal, cultural renewal, and bringing back a lot of these traditions. It's really important to be able to see these objects, because you can go back to the anthropological template, you can read the text, and it's like trying to learn a dance. By reading it, step to the left twice and to the right once, but it's not the same as being in the same space, and the same in the presence of these objects. You can see the materials, you can see the directions that they're weaving, you can see the finest details of how they end them. And in the case of water bottles, or these types of the water bottles, some of them that they do have in the collection too are also the ones that they were the water bottles. So basketry was the essence of California Indian culture. So right. They're tarred, they're lined with the asphaltum, all these details. So it's kind of the mix, the emotional, the personal, the communal, and also they become a teacher to us.
Yes. I mean, I think I should also add just a little bit of, archaeological context. Some of the oldest dates come from the Channel Islands. You have 13,000 years ago from the Northern Channel Islands and Santa Rosa Island or Wima, and then you have other 10,000-year-old dates for San Clemente Island and the Southern Channel Islands. So for us to kind of re-explore this archaeological material that has such a long timeline, I think we should also share with our visitors that in the 19th century, all of the Tongva Gambraleño people, or all of the island people, were gathered up and taken to the missions or the pueblos or some other kind of working condition. So there's been this long disconnect of trying to go back and understand the history. And sometimes this is where these collections kind of help fill in the gaps and complete the timelines. Otherwise, what happens, like you said earlier, the anthropologist, the archaeologist starts to make up their own interpretations for the things that are lacking, right?
Right, right. I mean, the museum in many ways becomes a cultural intersection to the people, to the public, but from these objects, these relatives, back to the people. Where is it that you're introduced to them once again? And there's so many different types of cultural material. I don't really like to use that word. It sounds so sterile, but these treasures that have never come out before too, really.
Right.
And we know what's present, but we've also had that conversation. So we have Palmer's collections, and Palmer had some of the most exquisite, why they have the most exquisite collections is that history is something that I would really encourage people to learn more about these collectors too.
Right. I mean, and speaking of Palmer, who's collecting from 1877 to 1895, his collection actually didn't come into the museum until 1905. And we won't go down the long, sordid tale of debates between he and Charles Lummis that's well documented about their kind of feud. But what I do want to show, and I do want you to talk about, especially as a member of the Tiat Society, about what it means to see these boats that Palmer collected from Redondo Beach. So I'm going to shift once again.
Yeah, it's an honor to see these beautiful canoes, or as we in Tongva, they're referred to as Tiat. In Chumash, it's Tomo. And typically you had many of them that carved out of soapstone or steatite. And make sure you kind of nuzzle up to that speaker, Karimah, so we can hear you.
Yeah, I was just showing first. I wanted to show the three that, we brought out to talk about for including in the Waterways exhibit.
Yeah. Yeah, there's three different, and your sound is still kind of muffled a little bit. Yeah, there's three steatite canoe models, small models of the Tiat. We can tell that one's a Tiat too, because it has around what we call the ears of the canoe. They're more angular. The Chumash were more rounded. So that's how we know this is a Tongva canoe, by the ears. But these models exemplify what was a tremendous tradition, the maritime tradition, with the sewn plank canoe, a very I guess it is kind of it's rare to our coast, but the sewn plank canoe tradition is not a common one to see in the United States. And so in our process, we actually have Momadihiko, and she became the first sewn plank canoe that was built. I won't say rebuilt, because she is actually a real Tiat in the early 1990s. And so for us to be able to see these canoes, it means a lot, because we know we make a lot of models of our canoes today, right? We make a lot of baby ones and to give to our friends. I mean, she's the heart and soul of the community. All of these things, they're all precious. They're all precious, whether they have provenance, provenance or not.
Right. I mean, what was really exciting is you asked, oh, do you have any stone boat vessels? And I was like, well, let me see. We began to search. We had one or two. A lot had said that they were missing, but because we were able to follow the Frank Palmer clues, we went from having these three that are out presented today to, I think we found at least 10. There were some that are ceremonial that had um, NAGPRA contexts that were highly decorated and came from burials. And then there were others that weren't as refined, didn't have the direct detail of the tiats. There were a couple that were bone, a couple that were wood. So
Mhm.
what we started to see as we started to kind of get on this mission of, oh, well, what can we find that represents um, early Tiat or early Tamil, since we were also working with Alan Salazar. And the next thing you know, the table was half full, and both of us could only really think of maybe Santa Barbara Natural History Museum having other um, stone boat effigies. So it was nice that our own collection could tell the story, could add to the story.
Right, right. And the fact also not only with the soapstone, the steatite canoes, but also the planks. The
Oh,
very,
right.
very few specimens of Tamil or Tiat of the canoe planks that even exist, which is a mystery in itself, why we don't see more evidence of the canoes. My theory is the canoes were never built to last forever. They were continually being rebuilt. And I'm sure a lot of people, a lot of them sunk too. So.
Right. I mean, that's what leads us to kind of our final slide and, to helping us think about the importance, like if the bigger question is archaeology stewardship? Are museums like the Autry who are stewarding archaeological material from the Tongva community and others, is it still important? Is it still valuable? I definitely am on that side who says, yes, and I'm working hard to reconnect uh, former researchers, former curators, community members back to their materials. But I think it's more important to hear from the descendant communities that the materials represent, what that means to be, a steward of those materials.
Well, and I think a lot of tribes throughout the United States, especially in a post-NAGPRA era, are experiencing having similar experiences and sentiments that the archaeological material is still very relevant. It's important. I mean, partially because if it's NAGPRA, then it becomes part of the patrimony. It's part of the sacredness of the people. But also, there's so much more when you're, let's say, within the Tongva people, when your people have been reduced to almost complete extinction and you are invisible and you want to gain this cultural confidence back, and part of it is in finding where are my relatives as you're glancing throughout the landscape that is now so different than from our ancestors' experience. Where are those relatives? And can they tell us something? And they do.
Mhm.
They always tell us something and they always tell us more. But the connect also is in adding another layer to that. And that's the tools that we do have in the contemporary times, technology, different kinds of things.
Mhm.
And what we can learn more about a lot of the collections. It's making that connection back. And I think also it's nurturing that relationship, having a collaboration. It's a collaboration with those objects just as much as we have a collaboration with the Autry.
Right. I mean, I was going to say, kind of looking at our slide prompt, that, what is in store for this collection in the present and in the future. Well, presently, you and I and Heidi Lucera, as you mentioned, and Alan Salazar and others are collaborating to bring the selected, maritime archaeological pieces that haven't been seen for quite some time to an exhibit. So that's one way in which, the stewardship is kind of funneling its way to making for, to bringing forth for exhibits. And then, like you mentioned, caring for the ancestors by making the greater collections more accessible to the Tongva community. I think our relationship on how we listen and what I share with you about the actual ancestors that we do house and care for has been meaningful. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what archaeologists and communities can do together to kind of help and heal the past of excavating these ancestors in the context that they were.
Right, right. And I mean, part of that relationship and the value of archaeological stewardship is there's an acknowledgement. There's an acknowledgement of these relatives. There's an acknowledgement of the descendant community. That's important. That erases that invisibility and makes you visible again. It's a renewal of cultural confidence back to the people that you do matter, that you are part, that you are significant and you are important and valid and will be part of this stewardship into the future. It's the whole caretaking, which is a traditional role as human beings that we're supposed to be practicing amongst each other as human beings, all of us as the same,
Right.
Right? The
Yeah.
stewardship of new generations, in the creation of tribal museums and repositories,
Right.
you know, and also different ways of looking at the material. And I'll use this as an example because I know this is something that just happened this week and with some of the baskets that we were looking at. And with Gabrielino Tongva baskets, there's an impression that they're very simple in their construction, very basic as far as any kind of ornamentation, any designs are usually very simple. And in one of the baskets, we had seen that there was even amongst the varnish, you know, the aging
Right.
basket, I noticed that the basil red from the juncus, which is the basic material that's used, that it appeared to be a pattern in there.
Mm.
And Desiree Martinez was with us and she says, why don't we de-stretch this? And de-stretch is another technique, photographic technique that you can enhance colors and images and everything. And we did that.
Right.
We were able to do de-stretch. And lo and behold, guess what?
There's a secondary pattern. I mean, so it speaks to the collaborations that can be done, you know, through a collection that has been stewarded for over 100 years. And I think this, you know, the Autry's commitment to that was with the MOU, in particular with your community, to kind of collaborate on programs and education and exhibits and how to care for collections and ancestors. So I feel like it's all building. Wendy, Dr. Teeter and I painted a larger narrative a couple of weeks ago about the intersections of the institutions and the various archaeologists. And I feel like you and I now are showing the interconnections between what can happen in the future between the communities and the collections that exist here. And then, you know, you and I have definitely presented on our share of panels and presentations about where we see the intersections between, you know, the collections here and, you know, collections at other institutions, Catalina Island Museum and UCLA Fowler Museum and the Autry Museum, of course. But I feel like we're just modeling what can be done with collaborations between other archaeologists for other areas who are interested in the Southwest or Mesoamerica or other things that are represented in our collection. And I'd kind of like to get your final thoughts as we start to wrap up a bit.
Well, we have to wrap up. I have a whole bunch more to
Say it, please.
Yeah, we could take every little nuance of things that we've mentioned today and just expand on it. But, you know, the Autry, when I think about the Southwest and the Autry, having that experience and knowing the Southwest, even as a little girl, you know, coming to the museum as a little girl and my children growing up coming into the Southwest Museum as a place you say, see that belonged, that was part of our heritage there. That was, or that is, you know, present or past. And then looking at the Autry as it is today. And they were both unique in their own sense. The Autry as a more contemporary, the Southwest as an image and almost like a became almost an icon of museums in Los Angeles, and the emergence of museums in Los Angeles and of culture and people really participating in that type of culture. And now they've merged, but it's still, the Autry still has that uniqueness. And the uniqueness now is that their collections are not, you've acquired, we've acquired collaborators,
Right.
this tremendous collection that reflects a significant history of many individuals, many pieces of land, many time sequences, and I said it earlier, Autry is an intersection, but I think just in reflecting back on my relationship, how long it's been, it's really important for us all to acknowledge that collaborations don't happen overnight.
Yes.
It's something that grows, it builds, it's nurtured. And, you have your push me, pull me, you have different sentiments. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's difficult. It's never easy. It's never easy as an institution when you are trying to work with any community. As human beings, that's the nature of who we are.
Right.
But it's possible. And we're the model of it being possible. And as you listed on that slide, the exhibitions that we're collaborating on and things that are not fixed in the past,
Right.
the fixed in the past imagery. We know things are situated in a past history, but yet they become alive. They're relevant today. These objects are alive.
Yes.
They have their own spirit, they have their own personality, and they have much to share with us, not only for the Native community, but so many children. If we're going to build our nation back up, they need to know the history of where you're at, where you come from, and be proud of where you're from.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's our responsibility as Native people to participate in that. It's a responsibility of the institution, so these collaborations continue to move and morph and change and grow, and they will long after I leave this planet.
No, thank you for that. Those are really good words for all of us to go by, to kind of think about how we can help, how we can contribute. I like to think of the archaeology collections being able to help communities push that timeline back further, right? When there are people who want to say, oh no, you didn't come into this area until, the historic period. Or, there's all these, misconceptions from various articles, even some written by Southwest Museum Master Key.
Right.
So it's nice to be able to do this continuum, have the contemporary and have the archaeological all in the same kind of circle. Yeah. But thank you so much, Cindy. I really appreciate you coming to talk with me kind of out loud to a variety of interested viewers as I kind of continue to explore what it means to kind of unpack and rehouse the collection and think more about stewardship and our responsibility. I appreciate you coming to talk with me and give me your thoughts and ideas as well for our visitors. And so I think there are some questions. Let's see, one question, Autry was built on the former. Any additional paid attention? That is news to me. I did not know that the Autry was built on a Tongva village. Did you know that, Cindy? I do know that actually Craig and I have been looking at Portola's map of Griffin Park, and there are 3 villages that he marked in the map, and that was 1769. And so we kind of have a sense of where those locations are. And of course, everything has been completely destroyed as they were, doing the Griffin Park landscaping of the exotics and other plant species. But I don't know of any village at the Autry specifically.
I'm not aware of any villages that have been identified, but let me say this too. We have to remember that the Tongva lived everywhere. It wasn't like having the urban, block of we very sedentary, we will stay here forever and ever, and trees will grow through our sidewalks. You moved. you moved with as the river moved, right? The
Mhm,
LA River's fixed behind us. So
mhm,
yeah, it's very possible. It's
mhm.
very possible. But see, here's this information too, as you said, in looking at the old maps, that we're having more realization. Also, we have to remind ourselves that the geographical landscape of Los Angeles and Los Angeles County has changed. You know, Earth has
Yeah,
been moved, and higher elevations have been reduced, lower elevations have been increased. You know, the landscape's been shifted in so many ways, and we really can't say with absolute certainty where anything was. It's part of there, we're feeding into archaeological stewardship right there,
mhm,
is taking responsibility for being able to look at these spaces, and because we're back to the relationship of objects to the land, you know,
right,
where they're from, as far as
right.
provenance and convenience.
That's a pretty popular question. Um,
Mhm.
where are there native village sites? Um, I say because I did a stint of contract archaeology, because there's constant development in Los Angeles. There are a lot of workshop and village materials that are constantly being exposed and destroyed. And to Cindy's point, it's possible that we're constantly surrounded by variations of archaeological material.
Yeah.
I will kind of answer the next two together. What are we currently working on with our archaeology objects, and how can we find ways to help with the stewardship process? They kind of go hand in hand. Two of the projects we're working on are because we have grant funds to look at National Park Service. They provided some funds to look more into their collections, and we have grant funds to look more into another collection. So as we get grant funded projects, we're able to kind of do a deep dive into other projects. It's because of collaborative work with other agencies that I'm now able to work with Cindy Alvitre and Heidi Lucero and Alan Salazar to bring out our maritime, specifically materials of both Chumash, Tataviam, Tongva, and Ahachiman territory to put on display in the future. So they go hand in hand. The more um, grants and funds that we get to kind of reopen these boxes and organize them better, the more we can put on display and work collaboratively with communities for exhibits. Oh, the Resource Center.
That's
Yes, that is
important.
where I am today. I will kind of expose my surroundings just to give everyone a little taste. I'm currently sitting in the archaeology study room. About half of the room is California materials. The other half is Southwest materials. It is the new Autry resource facility located in Burbank, California. The goal is for all of the materials from the previous Southwest Museum collection and the Autry's collection to all be situated here in this building with the archives, which is really important to my work. As I begin to kind of construct the expeditions and the surveys and whatever other project that the former curators or archaeologists were working on, they all had systematic notes and maps and photos that are housed with the Braun archives. And so it's nice that we're all under the same roof and we get to kind of collaborate and put the whole picture together. So that's where I'm at today, talking to Cindy as we're looking at the objects that she's interested in on the maritime communities for our exhibit.
I see one question I'd like to respond to.
Yes.
It says, what role do you see the Autry playing in archaeological materials and the communities the collections represent? I think that we've spoken a lot about how the community has come in. It's just not me. It's goes beyond just me as a Tongva person or affiliate with the Tongva community, and participating in guest curatorial roles in designing. We have our community artists who have also contributed to being able to retell the stories of the people, the history, cultural interpretation, translation of those individual objects. But another thing that's really important is And I have to say this selfishly because I always wanted to be a conservator, museum conservator, but I'm a little bit older than this young woman here. As I get moved closer, an inch closer and closer to 70. And at that time, it was more difficult for a person like myself. It was more complicated for a woman of color to become a conservator, right? And now we have these opportunities for our young people to enter into doing archaeology, becoming archaeologists, to become curators, to become exhibit designers, conservators, everything that becomes part of that stewardship. And also preparing a future not only for them as the relatives of the descendant communities, but for the descendant communities and all people who have the honor and of coming in contact and learning more about them. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, that was a good answer as well. There's a question about what we hope to come out of the Tongva Autry MOU. I mean, I can share my perspective. I think it's a great first step in kind of what we've been talking about, the integration of, community input into collections care and stewardship and education and programs, and in a way that is kind of unprecedented. There's not too many cases. I know it's a new trend now for everyone to try to get MOUs and, partnerships, but we were kind of in the early stages, probably behind UCLA, and trying to kind of build a partnership with the community on whose land we're on. So I see it kind of growing and developing and shaping into all kind of new, wonderful directions. But what do you think?
Well, I think we're seeing it. I think we're seeing it happen already. And as I've shared with our visitors, our virtual visitors, what my experiences, what our experiences have been coming up from the 1980s all the way to the present. We no longer have a seat at the table, but we have a voice. And our ideas are being embraced. It's playing an active role in the museum's interpretation, translation, and what they write about our people in particular. It's being able to have that determine our future.
Yeah, well said. There are a couple of questions about the essayist, your article from Latitudes.
Oh, what was that? Okay.
You want the title again?
The title of the book is LA, it's Latitudes. It's the Angelino's Atlas. It was published by Heyday Press, and I have a chapter in it called, I can't remember the name of the chapter.
I'll find it, and then
we'll find it.
I'll send it out. Yeah,
it has something to do with coyote. I remember that. See, that's what happens. You just forget this, but yes, it's Latitudes, and it's still what Latitudes is. It became a project. Malcolm Margolin, our genius editor, who organized News from Native California, Heyday Press, he wanted to compile an atlas, not a mapping atlas, but an atlas where different authors would contribute to these different parts of LA that are invisible or not really known well, like the bovine history, or here we are,
right.
the Tongva people. So it's a really cool book. It's very cool, very informative. There's lots in there.
Nice. There's a question about, does the LA County Museum of Natural History have significant collections? Yes, they do. A couple of weeks ago, one of my collaborators and colleagues, Dr. Wendy Teeter, and I kind of painted a very nice web of how the Natural History Museum and our collections have a lot of similarities and connections. There's a question about working with public land managers. Oh, I mean, I sit on a statewide curation committee from the Society of California Archaeology, and so does CAL FIRE and all of the other state agencies, and actually other federal agencies, and fire management and how to protect the land and how to protect resources always comes up at those local conferences. So it is definitely a conversation that I'm a part of, and that a lot of my colleagues here in Los Angeles are also a part of. There's a question about picking an object or two to highlight in the collections for mailing. Oh, we would love to do that. I would love to do that. Is there one object that you would own personally that has deep meaning to you?
That I would own personally?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if well, I can't own it. That's against the Tonga law. I don't know, the ones that I really treasure. I think oh gosh, you know what? I can't. The baskets really call to me. The baskets, especially this one that I just saw with this other pattern that we weren't able to see before. It's kind of fixed in my mind right now. I'm thinking about it because it looks like a water pattern. You know, we're working on the waterways exhibition that's calling attention and talking about the water. And so, you know, sometimes they become these signs that just support the work that we're doing. I don't know. That's a difficult question to respond to.
I mean, related to another question about waterways, there was an exhibit put on 6 to 8 years ago, but it took 10 years in the making. It was called Human and Nature, a part of a California Continued series. And within that exhibit, it's divided by kind of general regional sections. So right now it represents desert and plants and salmon and fire. And so because the Autry has such a wonderful native garden, we're taking down the plants exhibit and putting up a section on waterways in which we will discuss travel between the mainland and the islands and travel through the LA River, San Gabriel River, Santa Ana River, Santa Clara River, these major veins, these major waterways that kind of dump into the ocean that have been really important to the Chumash, the Tongva, the Tataviam, and the Ahachiman, which is the communities we are working on. And Cindy's one of the collaborators. And that will come out next year in the summer.
And I know we're real close to the end of this. And one of the questions was, can you tell, Margaret O'Rourke, can you tell us anything about the landscape shown behind you today? I think you're talking about me. It's actually an old historic photograph of the Los Angeles River, what it looked like in prior times. And yeah, I cherish those. May we all participate in, you know, the beauty and the healing and everything we need to come together as human beings to continue to shape an incredible future for everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Cindy, for joining me. This is new territory for me to kind of talk more about, you know, the work I do and the collaborations that I have and the collections that are here kind of behind me quite literally and how we can be better stewards. Right. And so we're setting up this Archaeology Steward series. Dr. Teeter was the first one, you're the second one. There will be a third in June if you're interested in seeing where I go with this and how we begin to explore further into exposing or re-exposing the archaeology collection. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Karimah. We will talk. We always have lots to talk about.
Yes.
In our conversation. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.